Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Knight. I'm professor of anthropology and religions of South Asia at Furman University, and I'm editor and co-director of Shuddhashar FreeVoice. I'm very honored today to be moderating this conversation on behalf of Shuddhashar FreeVoice. For those of you unfamiliar with us, we began in Bangladesh in 1990 as an independent little magazine and then became a publication house, supporting hundreds of writers and giving voice to ideas and others deemed too controversial to print. That work came at a deadly cost. Today, Shuddhashar FreeVoice operates in exile in Norway. It is a nonprofit dedicated to freedom of expression, social justice, and democratic culture. We remain a platform for writers and activists, including those in exile or under threat, who insist on the right to question, challenge, and imagine a better world. And it is in that spirit that we're here today, and that we've come to the subject of secularism, a concept that is both essential and, we also believe, widely misunderstood. So a little perspective from Shuddhashar. We believe that the state and the public institutions should be impartial across caste, color, religion, class, and so on, and that religious identity and religious law should not govern how a state is administered or how its citizens are treated. And that using religion as a weapon of politics is, in our view, deeply immoral. At the same time, we do not believe that secularism means hostility toward religion itself. And we recognize that religion has been a part of cultures and societies and countries, nations for a very long, long time. So we're not anti-religion either. But the question that we want to explore today is not whether religion belongs in human life or belongs in society. It's really whether societies can hold together that tension between religious belief and governance, between tradition and pluralism, between belonging and freedom, or whether that tension, if unmanaged, if it tears societies and people apart. These are not abstract questions. They're particularly urgent ones. They're urgent for many different countries, many different nations, and including right now Bangladesh, which recently had elections, and whose democracy is at a critical crossroads, and whose history with secularism is complicated, contested, and unfinished. But it's also an essential topic for other countries, like India, which just had its elections that gave the Hindu nationalists even more power than before. And I could go on through and list many other countries for which this is a very urgent question. To explore these questions, we are joined today by three exceptional thinkers whose work spans a variety of different areas, including but not limited to Algeria, France, India, and Turkey. Societies where secularism has taken very different forms and where its contradictions have been felt in very different ways. So I would like to introduce our speakers today, our guests today. Rajeev Bhargava is director of the Institute of Indian Thought at CSDS and is one of the world's foremost scholars of secularism and political theory, whose work has shaped how we think about the relationship between religion and the state in pluralist democracies. Marieme Hélie-Lucas is a sociologist, activist, and founder of two landmark international networks, Women Living Under Muslim Laws and Secularism is a Women's Issue. And she brings decades of frontline experience as well as academic work to the intersection of gender, rights, and secular politics. And Tuğçe Kayaal is assistant professor of history at Furman University, whose research explores identity, colonial history, and culture at the intersections of feminist and queer studies, including her forthcoming book on queer childhood in the Ottoman context. So welcome to all three of you. We're so very, very glad that you're here. And one other thing, today's webinar also marks the launch of our latest issue, Shuddhashar's latest issue, called Bangladesh, Return to Democracy. It's a timely publication, and we hope that this conversation here will complement and invigorate that issue further. So let's begin. And I would love to start with the most basic of questions, which is about definitions. And I know that each of you has your own understandings and experiences, but it would be great to start with some understanding of terminology. So maybe we could start with just secularism itself. What does it mean in your political or national context? And have you seen it change over time or recently? And Rajeev, maybe I'll start with you.
Right. Thanks for inviting me. I think the first thing to do is to make a distinction between secularism as a comprehensive worldview, such as secular humanism, and secularism as a social and political perspective. If we are really focusing on secularism as a political perspective, then the first thing to remember is to focus on the elementary structure of political secularism, which is that the state must be separated from religion for the sake of some values. This value-ladenness is also very important in secularism, because mere separation of religion and state for amoral purposes, that doesn't constitute secularism as we understand it, secularism as a project, secularism as something that we fight for. So this value-ladenness is important. And if we focus on this elementary structure of the separation of state and religion for the sake of some values, then many of the differences between secularisms in the world emerge on how we understand these values, how we combine these values, because there is not one but many values, and how we understand the meaning of separation, how we unpack the metaphor of separation. Now, if this is the kind of a bare bones, the skeleton of secularism, then let me just talk about Indian secularism. So Indian secularism, first of all, doesn't believe in strict separation or building a wall of separation between state and religion. Religion and state must be distant from each other, but not completely separated from one another. And the values for which this is done, some values are common to many other Western secularisms. For example, individual liberty, including individual religious liberty, equality of citizenship, or other forms of equality. But I think what makes Indian secularism really distinctive is that it introduces fraternity, not between communities, as an equally important value. Not the only value, but an equally important value. So one of the reasons why state and religion must be separated, and why any one religion must not be fused with a state, or there shouldn't be a total identification between state and religion, is because in a society which is religiously diverse, that fusion will have a terrible impact on fraternal relation between communities. And in fact, this particular notion of secularism in India arose in the 1930s after a huge amount of communal violence had taken place between different religious communities. And people realized that the state, instead of instrumentalizing religion for the sake of its own ends, must intervene to prevent violence between communities, but also to foster good relations between communities. Now, that's something which makes it very different from many Western notions, where neither community nor fraternal relations between communities is an important goal. Everything, the state separation of church and state is done for the sake of liberty or equality of citizenship. I shouldn't go on, but I would like to add something to it. There's another perspective. There's another sort of way of putting it, which I'd like to introduce at some point, but I think I'd like to stop here and allow others to move in.
Well, thank you. You gave us a lot to think about right there, and I know that we'll swing back around to hopefully the point that you didn't get to. Tuğçe, would you like to pick up on that, or?
Of course. Thank you, Lisa. First of all, thank you for your kind introduction. And I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation and very much looking forward to reading the special issue soon. So basically, the definition of secularism in context of modern Turkey, I'll take you to West Asia a little bit. It has quite a complicated history. Because in theory, just as in the definition Rajeev shared with us, secularism was basically understood and defined as a complete separation of state affairs from religious affairs, which was basically one of the founding norms or ideas of the early Republic of Turkey, which was officially founded in 1923. But so this definition, the separation of religion from the state, was basically first done to break any continuity, cultural, political, or historical connection to the Ottoman Empire. So the new regime under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, following the Greco-Turkish War, basically could define its ideology and where it stood by using this blank slate, right? I mean, by using secularism as a break from this imperial past. But the construction of secularism was very much, in theory, informed by its French version, laïcité. So basically, this new regime had this distance between itself and religion, mostly referring to Islam in this context. So the goal was, right, I mean, through this new discourse, new rhetoric, the new regime's goal was to reach the level of contemporary civilizations. That was the original discourse, rhetoric of the Republic of Turkey in its early years. And this, like the contemporary civilizations were, of course, defined through West and particularly Europe. But in practice, actually, when we look at secularism and its implementation in Turkey, we see it is more than separating state from religion, state affairs from political affairs from religious affairs. It is more about creating a notion of religion, mainly Islam, in a more controlled way. So instead of this distinct, clear, right, separation between state and religion, starting from the early years of the Republic of Turkey, we rather see the state's intervention in how people understand and practice religion. So basically, even in the first constitution in 1924, officially, the new Republic of Turkey's religion was defined as Islam. And only in 1928, that clause was removed, the state's official religion being Islam. And in 1937, when we look at the second article of Constitution, it was only then the Republic of Turkey was defined as a secular state, which basically they used the Turkified phrasing of laicite, laiklik. But when we look at the regulation of social lives and citizens' bodies, we see that again it was more about, right? I mean, exposing religious culture and knowledge, the exposing citizens to religious culture and knowledge that is controlled and filtered by the state. And one example of this was, even after the definition of Turkey as a secular state, we see that those that were targeted, the versions of Islam that were targeted and tried to be removed through state intervention were, non-Orthodox interpretations of Islam. Meaning that students starting in third grade, for instance, would learn about religious culture because the new secular state actually had a ministry dedicated to regulate religious affairs. Students through the universal curriculum would know about, on the paper, religious cultures in general, but even when I was in primary school, what we learned about was an interpretation of Orthodox Sunni Islam. So basically, as part of the, these interventions in how citizens live and experience religion and how they appear in public life, which is basically probably one of the most controversial issues in the history of Republic of Turkey, is headscarf issue, because for many years, women with headscarf were not allowed to go to universities and attend courses. So basically, we see this more regulation of citizens' bodies and how they should live and experience Islam and their religious beliefs through the strict state regulations. So basically, going back to my original point, I would say secularism in Turkey certainly in theory tried to imitate or promote how Rajeev defined it, but in practice, actually, we see that it was used as a tool, very much embedded, actually, in the definition of Turkish nationalism as well, especially Orthodox Islam. So it was mostly used as a tool to regulate the forms of knowledge and information about Islam citizens can have access to and practice in their daily lives, very briefly.
Interesting. So in some ways, it sounds like we see sort of a dismantling of some of the ideas of what secularism is in the Turkish context, even despite certain original aspirations. Your point about the regulation of bodies is something I hope we can get back to as well. I think that's quite interesting.
Of course.
So let's keep moving westward, and would love to hear from you, Marieme, about your thoughts on this topic.
I think I'll come back on what has been said already, but I want to compare the two definitions of secularism. And first of all, since it's part of a program and secularism in Bangladesh, I would like to remember all of us that Taslima Nasrin, Bangladeshi feminist writer, more than 30 years ago, started to use the word laïcité, which she spelled in a British way with a Y at the end, to mark this enormous difference between secularism and laïcité. And I'll use this term today. I'll start with one important point, because both France, the initiator of laïcité, and the UK had big empires, and we were part of these empires at one point in history. It's important for us in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, everywhere, to understand that these two definitions cannot be dealt with an S at secularism. It is absolutely a drastic difference. So let me start with France. The concept of laïcité dates from the French Revolution, 1789. So you can see it's long ago. And if you read in the newspapers today that this is a concept which is basically anti-Muslims, it's just ridiculous ignorance. So this concept has been built because of the political power of the Vatican, the Catholic Church. Just to briefly remember that the King of France was crowned in a cathedral by an archbishop, etc., in the name of God. So in 1789, France decided to get rid of the political power of the Vatican, not of the religion, right? And what was chosen was the form of a republic and of democracy. There was a long period during which the Catholics and the Vatican, especially, but the Catholic hierarchy, was fighting back against the Republic and against laicity. It lasted from the French Revolution to the law of 1905. It's a long period, and there are articles which describe all the attempts that were made to crush this question of laicity. As it was said, it's a law on separation between state and religion, precisely because they had far too much of collusion between Catholic religion and the kingdom. So first of all, I'll just describe what the law is. Article 1 says the secular republic guarantees all citizens freedom of belief and of practice. And it includes specifically people who have no religion. Their right to have no religion is part of this Article 1. Article 2 says the secular republic does not recognize religions, their representatives, not dialogue with them, not fund them, etc., etc. So it's a clear distinction between belief. You can believe whatever you like, it's your personal business. The state has nothing to do with that. And it's interesting because it's formulated in such a way that, in fact, the state declares itself incompetent in beliefs matters, not just in religion, in all beliefs. You can believe in angel or in jinn or whatever, in God and goddesses and whatever. That's your personal belief, and nobody, in the name of secularism, will prevent you from believing and practicing. Okay. Now let's compare this with secularism, which has been really built around the UK and the fact that the King of England is also the head of the Anglican Church. In other words, there cannot be any separation. So this definition, initial definition by France, has been replaced by secularism means equal tolerance by the state of all religions. The state is neutral, in other terms, but interacts, negotiates, has all sorts of political business with religions. And of course, it doesn't mention non-religious people. If we look at Britain, but not just at Britain, at all the ex-colonies of Britain, you can see the emergence of communalism. Communalism is the fight between communities in order to get more recognition, more advantages, more visibility, etc., by the state. So it creates the conditions of communalism and antagonism and fight between so-called communities. I want to come back on this question of communities. how does one belong to a community? On the example of France, we have only citizens, whatever their beliefs are. In the case of Britain, we have different categories of citizens, which are labeled through officially declared religions as being ruled by different laws depending on the community you belong to. Now, how do you belong? Do you choose to belong? Or are you forced into a community by law, for instance? And just in the name of where you were born, what was the religion of your parents, what's your name, first name in particular. So can we consider this a democracy if we cannot step out of the community we are assigned to, whether we want to or not?
Yeah.
And the so-called religious laws are unvoted. They are declared. Declared is not the right word. Sorry. They are officially announced by the clerics. They are never voted. Is this a democracy?
Marieme, you have given us so many things to think about.
Are not voted for either. They are self-appointed. They are all males, everywhere I know. And they are, very generally speaking, quite reactionary, especially in the view of women's rights. So,
yeah, Marieme, I think you've given us so many things to think about, and I want us to make sure that we touch on those different points. So you talked about the role of the state in treating each person as a citizen, right, as opposed to treating them as a religious subject. And I'm wondering, Rajeev, if you have some thoughts about how that plays out differently in South Asia, because I mean, you mentioned other things that having to do with fraternity between religions and you know, the importance of recognizing values. So I wonder if you could just explore that a little bit.
No, I'll return to Europe in order to highlight the Indian or the South Asian case. I think we must understand the history of Europe. I'm sure everybody does, but I just remind everybody. The wars of religion, which after the breakdown of Latin Christendom, which produced so much violence, and not only violence, but expulsion of people and transfer of populations. And what happened after a couple of treaties, such as the Augsburg Treaty and later the Westphalia Treaty, is that everybody agreed that in every territory, whatever allegiance to whichever church or adherence to whichever interpretation of the Christian doctrine was publicly confessed by the ruler in that territory, that would be embraced by the entire community. And those who did not wish to do that have two options. One is to leave, and they were forcibly expelled. And if they decide to stay on, then they faced death. Because once it became a political ideology, right? Religion became a political ideology. Then to dissent from the professed religious doctrine, the doctrine professed by the king or the church, was also political. sedition. And so the whole of Northern Europe became Protestant in one way or another, and the whole of Southern Europe became Catholic in one way or another, and this includes France. So all of Europe, at least all of Western Europe, shares that history. And secularism in different forms, the idea of, so what begins is the birth of confessional states, very closely aligned states and churches. And the whole response afterwards is the beginning of deconfessionalization, unchurching movements, where people find that in various ways, the church is either too socially oppressive or it is politically meddlesome, and it professes a dogma and doesn't allow for openness of mind. And there were a lot of movements, of course, led by the bourgeois. I mean, the French Revolution is one example, and by anti-feudal currents, the birth of individualism, all of which were responsible for this whole current, which led to de-religionization, deconfessionalization, and therefore the birth of secularism of a certain kind. But we have to remember that all these secularism arose in all of Europe, including in France. All these secularisms arose in predominantly single religion societies. Britain had become Anglican. France was Catholic, with some Huguenots and some Jews, but predominantly Catholic. The whole of, in Scandinavia was Lutheran, and Scotland was Presbyterian. In fact, these were the dominant churches here. So these were predominantly single religion societies. Religious diversity had been removed in unethical ways through violence or through expulsion. And this happened in Britain as well as in France. We know that there were the big wars that took place in France. We remember this in Bartholomew Massacre. So having said that, in France, the model, as Marieme pointed out, the model was that religion is privatized, which means it is not allowed to come into the public domain, particularly the official public domain, which is the state. So religion must be kept out of the state, but the state continues to have the right to intervene in religious matters, either to help religion or to hinder it. Both are possible. Intervention could be negative or positive, and France did it till 1905, and even after 1905, in all kinds of informal ways. I mean, I don't have the statistics in hand right now, but there is inter-religious inequality with a lot of, because of the history and the culture of the place, a lot of privileges being given to Catholics and not so much to particularly new immigrants, because Europe has seen unprecedented diversity, the like of which it is not seen in modern times, after decolonization and after globalization. And it is this which is causing a problem for French laicity, the presence of religious diversity and the unequal benefits that are available to different religious groups in France, as indeed in many countries in the whole of Europe, and not just. But in America, which is the case is slightly different. And in Britain, Marieme has already talked about, I mean, it was no different. These are situations which are very different from South Asia. In America, you have a certain religious pluralism, but this is denominational pluralism within Protestantism. I mean, Catholics had a very hard time getting the sort of privileges that they now are used to. the Jews had a hard time, and even other religions have to, in some ways, Protestantize themselves in order to get all the benefits that they get, even though there is strict separation between, at the federal level at least, perhaps at all the state level, between the church and the state. So the American case is very different, where you have strict separation between church and state. This is mutual exclusion of state and religion. Religion will not interfere in the affairs of the state will not interfere in the affairs of religion, but for the sake of what? Primarily for the sake of religious freedom, for denominational pluralism, and then for equality of citizenship as democracy sets in. In France, it is one-sided exclusion. As I said, religion cannot interfere in the state, but the state can interfere in religion. It can fund schools, which it does. It can up the upkeep of most of religious architectural buildings that had, until 1905 at least, done by the French state. And I can give you other examples. I don't have the statistics at hand, but I've referred to in many of my articles. So I think the mutual exclusion and one-sided exclusion model for the sake of various individual rights, that's one issue. But the primary issue that we faced was precisely after the coming of European colonial modernity, the fact that our faith was transformed into European-style religions. And therefore, communal conflict began literally copying, imitating, emulating what had happened in Europe in the 16th, 17th century. So you have communal divisions growing, you have communal conflict, communal violence. So the first thing that everybody thought of when they thought of an impartial state, a state which separates itself from religion, is to bring peace and encourage a high degree of sociability between different religious communities, because they've always been part of our landscape. They've always been there. Religious diversity is not something which has come recently, nor has it been removed unethically at any time in the past. It's just been part of our natural landscape. So when these communities are there, how do we keep them? So I'll put it another way: prevention of inter-religious domination. However, there is another issue which is very important in India, as indeed it must be in other South Asian societies, which is to keep the state and keep religion and state separate, to prevent intra-religious domination. And this is something that, of course, European struggles have been all about, the domination of the church, and for the sake of individual liberty. And here, in India, I'll just talk about two: intra-religious domination. One is domination of other sects within a particular religion. Second, within Hinduism, there is the deeply oppressive hierarchical caste system. So you have to, and which is religiously sanctioned. So you have to get rid of that. That means intervening in religion. And the third, of course, is patriarchy of various kinds, women's domination. And all religions are guilty of that. There is not a single religion which is not guilty of this. So the state has to, that's why I said the state in India has to keep a principled distance. It has to distance itself, but based on whether or not intervention will promote inter-religious and intra-religious and inter-religious equalities and freedoms and fraternities, the state will intervene in religions or refrain from intervening. If that refrain from intervening is all very important, because religious freedom will be nothing if the state intervenes at any time in religious matters. But when religious excesses are going on within religious communities or between religious communities, the state has to step in, as indeed it did in Europe, right? But not for religious diversity. That has never been an issue until the 20th century. So in India, state secularism, that is the other way of looking at it. You see, I talked about fraternity, but India, secularism is not against religions, meaning religious belief, religious practice, even public expressions of religion. In India, religion means nothing if it was not for religious processions. I mean, for so many Hindus, bathing in the Ganga is a public matter which cannot be done without the help of the state. And therefore, you cannot think of privatizing religion. It's not just a matter of, having a little place of worship at home. These are public outpourings, right? Mm-hmm. Festivities. Now, you have to, so the point is, not against religion in this sense, practice or belief, and practice must be taken seriously. It is a very public matter, right? Mm-hmm. It is not just it's not private. Practice cannot be just a little ritual at your altar at home. It's a social and public issue. So protecting religious practice, but against institutionalized religious domination in both its forms, inter as well as intra. And that is an issue, I'm afraid, which is there. I do not want to say anything about Europe, but I can say that the European secularisms on these very highly homogeneous societies will be in crisis in the face of deep religious diversity, which is growing in 20th century. In India, it is both these continue to plague us. We are trying our best, but not succeeding always, failing quite a lot of, and we will talk about other threats to secularism at some point of time. But this is a big issue in all of South Asia, but I can certainly say very confidently about India.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that the context of South Asia is super different, right, in terms of its religious diversity and how that has emerged and been a part of the landscape for such a long time. The question then is about how to manage that diversity. One thing that I would love to hear a little bit more from you all about is the question about that management, especially when, on the one hand, there are practices that are not okay, right? That at least morally we can say are not okay. If it's a caste system or patriarchy or the mistreatment of or banning of and attacks on LGBTQ peoples, right? So these are often couched within religious terms, if not actually emerging from them. So if they are part of, or at least some reflection of, or some connection to religion, how does the state manage that and still also manage, some sense of pluralism, if that's part of what the state prefers, or and we can also jump to the French model as well. If the state does not intervene at all in matters of religion, then how do we deal with those kinds of things? So, Tuğçe, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I want to give the chance for you as well to sort of respond on these complex questions.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. I think especially in contemporary politics in Turkey, following the current AKP development, Justice and Development Party's administration, and the rhetoric deployed by the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, we see a more divisive and moralistic discourse. My voice echoes. Is it?
It's echoing, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, so basically we see a more, like the deployment of more moral and divisive rhetoric, which is basically othering and creating a more, like the explicit moral hierarchy between citizens. So basically this happens first through the otherization of non-Muslim citizens. Although, right, in theory, according to law, regardless of citizens' religious affiliation, they should all be treated equal in the, like before the law and in the, like the eyes of the state. But in practice, we see actually many, right? I mean, non-Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Armenian citizens, Greek citizens, they are dealing with various level of injustices. This is about access to education and equal treatment with Turkish Muslim citizens. But currently, especially the LGBTQ politics is more like LGBTQ citizens are more under threat in Turkey because, I mean, starting last year, current republic, right, current state declared last year the year of family, and they decided to expand it into 2030. And now the whole discourse is about how the presence of LGBTQ citizens, including pride marches, visibility in any kind of popular or social media or even everyday life, started to be labeled as a threat to the moral order, right? I mean, people are being arrested hours before the pride marches now every year, or popular figures are under arrest with misaccusations, although we all know that the real reason is who they are and their sexual orientation. So I think even this, like the theoretically, Turkey continues to be a secular state. We see that in practice, the hierarchies and injustice treatment of citizens who do not fit into this actually very moralistic Sunni Muslim construction of citizenship are further under threat and deprived of their rights, even like the right to live their lives and be visible in social life.
I would like to come back on the question of laws which are not voted and what it does to women in particular. I would like to go back to Indian examples. The case of Shuddhashar in a question of divorce, well, this young woman was just thrown out on the street with not even a luggage. Her husband divorced her, in fact, repudiated her. This was in 1983. And she went to the Supreme Court, which means that she wanted non-religious law, but voted laws to help her in this question of divorce, under the pressure of the Muslim minority, which is oppressed, etc. in India. We all know that. She finally decided to abandon her case in justice. But it's really important to see that, at least in those examples, women want a law which is above religions. Right now in the UK, they have about 300 what they call Sharia courts, which deal exclusively with the problems of personal law, that is the family law. No criminal law, no nothing. Religion applies only to what affects women. And it's very difficult for women who have been pushed into going to our community law to step out. They are entitled to do that. But who has the energy, the force, the psychological force to do that? Say, okay, I don't want your judgment, and I'm going back to the law of the land. So we see more and more of this. I'll give you an example from France. There was a couple very, very recently, two Tunisians, but living in France, etc. They got married, and the day after the marriage, the husband said, I don't want her anymore. She was not a virgin. So the woman said, okay, let's divorce. But then he said, no, I want an annulation of my marriage, and there was a French judge to say, okay, I will ask for an annulation of your marriage. The state had to intervene and said, no, it's against the law. Virginity is not, it was described by the husband as an essential, I'm quoting, an essential condition of the marriage. This is not in the French law. So we are again and again, I could give you other examples, but again and again, well, there's a nice one in which we won. So I have to tell you this example. There was in Britain, a man from Pakistan and a woman from Nigeria. They were students, they married, they had a little girl, etc. Then the husband started being more and more acquainted with the Muslim fundamentalist organization. And he asked for a divorce. And she said, okay. But then he told the judge, I want to be divorced under Islamic law. Right? And the judge said yes. So we had to mobilize the whole network, and divorce judgments from all over the world, Muslims, were sent to the judge. And they were all different, all different. So the core question is, if we recognize the right for religions to have their own laws, where is the state? Where is citizenship?
Right. I think Rajeev wanted to make a point also. Put your sound on, please.
I have the greatest respect for and admiration for the movement for women's rights and women's empowerment that is taking place, particularly after the Second World War, up to maybe the end of the 20th century, which has actually won so many rights to women, for women, but it's a very recent phenomena in Europe as well. I mean, it's not something
of Europe.
No, I'm talking about Europe. I mean, I think. I mean, look at the number of countries that extended universal adult franchise. It was only in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean, a lot of women's emancipation really took place after the Second World War, when so many men were killed in the war, and many jobs that men were doing were simply not, women had to perform them. So a large impetus to get out of the house and come to the public place really happened after the Second World War. I'm saying this not to undermine the achievements, it's just that it's a very recent phenomena. And it's the kind of problems, of course, these personal laws are terribly oppressive. I grant that. But all I'm saying is that this is something that is, if you look at the Orthodox Jews, if you look at Orthodox Hindus, if you look at Orthodox Catholics, look at the problem, or Protestants for that matter. The kind of orthodoxy that you find among the Catholics and the Protestants. Look at the treatment which has been given. Mistreatment of doctors in America who have had abortion clinics. The kind of atrocious behavior towards them. Religion is all these religions, major religions of the world, born in the 6th century BCE onwards, up to the role of women has been very, very poor. The status of women has been very poor, and it's been like that since till the 19th century, till the 20th century, and as I said, these are new problems in France which emerged. I don't know how the French dealt with their colonies in the early 20th century, but it's only when people from former colonies who were still trapped in their orthodoxies, when they started to come to France. This is what we have to remember. Once you make full citizens, immigrants are no longer residents, but full citizens, then it's not just, they are not just there as economic subjects. They are there with full cultural. They come with a culture, they come with a religion, and they come with a religion and colonies where they were. And I don't want to use the term backward or forward here, but certainly on the women's issue, there's been a very big problem. Question is, see, that's what I was saying. The principal distance idea is trying to make contextual judgments in the face of multiple values. Freedom is a very important issue, but fraternity and belonging is also an important issue. Everybody doesn't have the luxury of being a pure citizen. In most places, citizenship and religiosities are intertwined, and no matter how hard we try to disentangle them, this will not happen immediately. And we've got to find ways of resolving these issues, these very complex issues, in a manner which is much more fine-tuned and nuanced than is available through the law in some countries. So I would just say that this requires an enormous amount of cultural sensitivity and patience, both in India. I mean, all the cases that you mentioned about Shah Banu, by the way, was not because of communalism. It was Muslim orthodoxy that forced her. It was not Hindu communalism, right? So I think it was the assertiveness of Muslim, but the state also played a role. Instead of appealing to its laws, which India has. I mean, after all women are equal citizens. And they have the option to either choose the civil law or choose the community law. In India, we have this option. They are not ruled only by community laws. They also have the option. But, you know, how many people are able to exercise that option? Because of the communal pressure that you talked about. So I think
that's where it gets quite complex.
Yeah, it's a little more complex than is allowed for in many discourses.
Yeah, Tuğçe, I know you had your hand up. You wanted to say something, and I think that, you know, the tension here is, I mean, very real, right? The kinds of laws that people think they have or think they must follow because of social pressures or community pressures, versus the laws that are actually available to them if they know the way to get there. And they don't not everybody feels empowered to exercise their rights in those kinds of ways. But Tuğçe, please.
Just basically, yeah, I mean, and I'll keep it very brief. I also value and find so important the post-secular turn in both, you know, like the feminist and queer movement, because basically in more traditional, right, I mean, conception of Muslim women, we have read, right, this Western liberal perspective, have read Muslim women's agency as invisible and define them usually through victimhood. But actually, right, I mean, when you look at Muslim women's, especially immigrant Muslim women's experiences, I mean, I include Turkey, but also Western European context. Unfortunately, secular regimes, this is not necessarily a black and white situation, does not always guarantee the right of Muslim women, and discrimination, right? I mean, especially for brown women, Muslim women is always there and affect their lives. So in that context, I just want to bring in more, you know, like the Sabah Mahmoud's, Lila Abulugod's scholarship on how we need a more nuanced, right? I mean, reading of citizenship and rights of women, especially Muslim women, immigrant women who are pushed to margins of the societies, right? I mean, they live in, even in secular context, because that doesn't always guarantee them equal treatment, right? I mean, with their Western white counterparts. So just that's what I wanted to say very quickly.
Well, I think you're right to bring up, you know, Sabah Mahmoud and Lal Abu Mughal, because they remind us, right, that women, for example, are not monolithic, right? Even if they're practicing Muslims wearing hijab, they're not monolithic. They come at it from very different perspectives and different positionalities, and so I think you're right to caution us about being too over with regards to these kinds of questions. I do know that we're running close out of time, but Marieme, you had your hand up, so maybe if you have a short something to add, and then we can wrap things up.
Yes, I want to point at the fact that human rights are being misused,
Yeah.
and that women's rights come after minority rights, religious rights, ethnicity, all sorts of other concepts which are preserved and supported by human rights organizations before women's rights. That was all.
No, that's a good point. I think if there's a hierarchy, we can often put women pretty low in that hierarchy, and there's certainly many other hierarchies as well that are equally damaging or significantly damaging to individuals. So as you know, we also had this question about how does secularism fit within not just our individual contexts, the places that you have knowledge, where your expertise lies, but how can this translate into something that's productive for the Bangladesh context, where was founded with the concept of secularism being a grounding concept of its independence, and then when that concept was removed and then reinstated, and has had a very complicated relationship with what it means to be, in this case, Bangladeshi. It is, like India, quite diverse, less diverse as every year goes by, but nonetheless, that's the background. So where should the debates about what secularism is and what the relationship between state and religion are, where should those debates happen?
3 or 4 points here. One is, and this is something which Bangladesh has experienced both these in the past 50, 60 years. I think it's very important for Bangladesh not to declare itself an Islamic state. I mean, all citizens, they must enjoy equal rights, equal privileges. They have to share equal burdens, of course, but one of the ways to diminish them is to construct the picture of the state as one which makes it exclusive, it's belonging exclusively to one community. And I think that is a danger in India as well. I mean, to make it, I mean, that is what confessional states in Europe were like. This is, the identification of one religious community with the state and the state's identification with itself to one religious community. I think that's, the second is, I mean, how to avoid the public presence of religion is one thing, but an aggressive presence which demeans and humiliates others is quite another. And I think, yes, one solution is to say nobody in public, but as I said, this is impossible in South Asia, as indeed it's impossible in many Catholic countries, or Muslim countries for that matter. But I think, so that's how to reduce aggressive public presence of religions. One of the ways of doing it is to make the state, may have a nameless state, don't call it secular, but don't identify it with any one religion. Then the importance of Sharia, I think, again, it's a deeply ironical that at least in South Asia, all these Sharia laws came into existence in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, there were customary laws, and these customary laws were followed by Hindus and Muslims alike in various local regions. But suddenly you had these Hindu personal laws and Muslim personal laws. They came up. The British somehow constructed them. And now we are victims of these personal laws, which are, I mean, I'm not saying that laws, the customary laws were all great, but at least there was some flexibility. And now with these codified, rigid, compartmentalized laws, the kind of flexibility that was available is not there. There is great homogenization. There is a pan-Indian idea of all Muslims have to be under one pan-Indian law, all Hindus have to be under one. This is something which is definitely very disturbing. But both ultranationalism, how do we check that? How do we ensure that there is the Bangladesh, there are I'm talking about South Asia. This is, and no advice given to anybody. It's just my observations from the little experience that I have reading and experiencing these places. Again, both ultranationalism and religious extremism, religious orthodoxy, both are threatening to freedoms, to equalities, to justice, to fairness, in preventing humiliation and degradation of people. And last of all, I think there is a great void, a moral void that is being created. And I'm going to bring global capital, global expansionist capital, ruthless capitalism of the last 30 years. It's just shrinking space for any concern for the other, and certainly no space for fairness and justice. Every progressive social law or norm has been reversed in the last 30, 40 years, at least in India. That is because people have no patience. They have no compassion, no generosity, no concern for the other, no sense of treating others as equals, because the moral space is shrinking. And what is worse, is actively destroyed. And I think both a certain kind of leadership and global capital plays a very important role in this. So I think in your message, you talked about threats to secularism. And we are looking for peaceful societies which are on their path to becoming more egalitarian, more fair, more just, more freer for all citizens, and of course for women who have been perhaps the most subjugated of all for the last 2,000, for several millennia. I think for that to happen, these secularism, I would say, at least in the way that I conceive it, is absolutely indispensable for that public space where there is openness and where space for negotiating freedom, justice, and equality for everybody.
Yeah, those are good points. And for the record, Bangladesh is Islam is the state religion of Bangladesh since 1988. But the point that you're making, I think, is what's really key, is that regardless of what it's called, right? Is it an aggressively Islamic state? Is it, who are the actors that are pushing an agenda, a religious agenda forward?
And say one thing, and the impact it has on its neighbor, and impact that what India does to its own minorities on Bangladesh and in other places is just horrendous.
It's horrendous.
And so even one single Hindu in Bangladesh is mistreated, that is an enormous threat to all Muslims in India.
Yep.
And I think that is something that both countries have to realize. I think their good neighborliness is not possible if we don't treat our internal minorities well. And I think Bangladesh has as much responsibility as India does. And I think, one of the biggest problems, and this is not just other minorities, even Bangladeshi Muslims who were secular and who were atheists. they were murdered in the past regime, not in the intervening regime, in this period post Hasina and before this new person Rahman has come in. In that period, that was a very dangerous period in my reckoning of Bangladesh. But I think even before that, I mean, this is a basic thing, which I think, and that is where I welcome laicite. I mean, you believe whatever you want, whatever, it's your choice. Whether you believe in one God, many gods and goddesses, or no God. That is none. It's not just no business of the state. It's no business of any other community.
Yeah.
It's my individual or group choice, and I should be left free. And I think that basic thing is always threatened in South Asia.
Yeah, right. And to believe or to not believe, to practice to not or not practice. Exactly. Yeah. So I do like this idea of sort of thinking forward about, is there space for more freedom and more community? But Marieme and Tuğçe, do you have a few last words to add to this before we sign off?
I think that if people were not so afraid of religious fundamentalists backed by the state in so many instances, we will realize that there are so many people who are secular, so many who are atheists in our countries. I'm speaking of Muslim countries. Absolutely everywhere today, I'm in contact with secular groups, including in the most difficult places, Afghanistan or Iran or whatever you did. We exist. We exist. But we are not
excluded, right?
It's really important to acknowledge this. For the first time in France, which is secular for ages now, there was a study at the beginning of the years 2000, which showed that for so-called Muslims and so-called Catholics, Christians, not Catholics, there was an equal proportion of people who declare themselves atheists, 25%, which is enormous. Declaring oneself atheist is something different from having some distance with religions. Only 3% in each of the so-called religious communities declared themselves believers, practicing, etc. And the rest, which is the vast majority, as you can see yourself, they like to celebrate festivities, whether it's Eid, Christmas, something nice and fun with the family, but that's all they do in terms of practicing religion.
Right. Then it's about community rather than
an important reality.
All right, Tuğçe, you get the last word.
So basically, I'll keep it very short and simple, perhaps, because I was very much inspired by the questions you shared with us too. I think we follow up to Rajeev's points too. We need a genuine, neutral state towards any religious affiliation and belief, so we can have a conversation about citizenship rights and belonging that really treats people as who they are, as citizens, not necessarily in affiliation with this assigned communal belongings to them. So.
Nice, thank you. If only all communities could converse like we have here. I mean, we only had a short window of time, but we did come at this with quite different kinds of experiences and perspectives and views on, the role of secularism and laicite, and yet we managed to listen well and reach a good understanding, I believe. So we should end up here because we've gone way over our time, but it was a very, very rich conversation that could have continued for much, much longer than this. Want to thank you all for coming. Three of you, really appreciate having this chance to hear your ideas more and learn more about your views and your experiences, and giving a chance to exchange your expertise and on this platform. So really, really appreciate that. And I will thank the audience out there as well. And we will talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marieme. Thank you, Tuğçe, and thank you, Lisa, for
Thank you.
arranging this. Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you very much. We'll remain in touch. Thanks.
Will do.